teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, listeners and learners. The most honorable President Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, respected ministers and doctors, honorable advocates, advertisers, administrators and advisors, reverend fathers and mothers, affectionate sons and daughters. I, Dr. RKM from USA, heartily, cordially welcome all of you. It is really nice time, nice place, nice action. You are going to listen the romantic age in English literature. Literature is the mirror of our society. So everyone should go through the literature for knowing the maturity of language. Literature recreates our society and nation with its and instructions. The period we are considering begins in the later half of the reign of George III and ends with the accession of Victoria in 1837. When on a foggy morning in November 1789, King George entered the House of Lords and in a trembling voice recognized the independence of the United States of America. He unconsciously proclaimed the triumph of that free government by free men, which had been the ideal of English literature for more than 1,000 years. Though it was not till 1832 when the Reform Bill became the law of the land that England herself learnt the lesson taught her by America and became the democracy of which her writers had always dreamed. The half century between these two events is one of great turmoil, yet of steady advance in every department of English life. The storm center of the political unrest was the French Revolution. That frightful uprising which proclaimed the natural rights of men and the abolition of class. The effect on the whole civilized world is beyond computations. Patriotic clubs and societies multiplied in England, all the doctrine of liberty, equality, fraternity, the watchwords of the revolution. Young England, led by Pitt the Younger, hailed the new French Republic and offered it friendship. Old England, which pardons no revolutions but her own, looked with horror on the turmoil in France and misled by Burke and the nobles of the realm, forced the two nations into war. Even Pitt saw a blessing in this at first, because the sudden real for fighting a foreign nation, which by some horrible perversion is generally called patriotism, might turn men's thoughts from their own to their neighbors' affairs, and so prevent a threatened revolution at home. The causes of this threatened revolution were not political but economic. By her inventions in steel and machinery, and by her monopoly of the carrying trade, England had become the workshop of the world. Her wealth had increased beyond her widest dreams, but the unequal distribution of that wealth was a spectacle to make angels weep. The invention of employment in order, the invention of machinery at first threw thousands of skilled hand workers out of employment. In order to protect a few agriculturists, heavy duties were imposed on corn and wheat, and bread rose to famine pieces just when laboring men had the least money to pay for it. There followed a curious spectacle. While England increased in wealth and spent vast sums to support her army and soldiers, her allies in Europe, and while nobles, landowners, manufacturers, and merchants lived in it increasing luxury, a multitude of skilled laborers were clamoring for work. Fathers sent their wives and little children into the mines and factories, where 16 hours labor would hardly pay for the daily bread. And in every large city were riotous mobs made up chiefly of hungry men and women. It was this unbearable economic condition, and not any political theory, as Burke supposed, which occasioned the danger of another English revolution. It is only when we remember these conditions that we can understand two books, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and Thomas Paine's Right of Man, which can hardly be considered as literature, but which exercised an enormous influence in England. Smith was a Scottish thinker who wrote to uphold the doctrine that labor is the only source of a nation's wealth, and that any attempt to force from freely obtaining the raw materials for its industry in unjust and destructive. Paine was a curious combination of Jekyll and Hyde, shallow and untrustworthy personally, but with a passionate devotion to popular liberty. His Rights of Man, published in London in 1791, was like one of Burns' lyric outcries against institutions which Bastille. It added fuel to the flames kindled in England by the French Revolution. The author was driven out of the country on the curious ground that he entered the English Constitution, but not until his book had gained a wide sale and influence. All these dangers, real and imaginary, passed away when England turned from the affairs of France to remedy her own economic conditions. The king. The long continental war came to an end with Napoleon overthrow at Waterloo in 1815, and England, having gained enormously his prestige abroad, now turned to the work of reform at home. The destruction of the African slave trade, the mitigation of horrible unjust laws which included poor debtors and petty criminals in the same class, the prevention of child labor, the freedom of the press, the extension of manhood suffrage, the abolition of the restrictions against Catholics in Parliament, the establishment of hundreds of popular schools under the leadership of Andrew Bell and Joseph Lancaster. These are but a few of the reforms which mark the progress of civilization in a single half century. When England in 1833 proclaimed the emancipation of all slaves in all her colonies, the unconsciously proclaimed her final emancipation from barbarism. There are some literary characteristics of this age that must be understood by our scholars of literature all over the world, those who are studying in the different universities. It is intentionally note how literature at first reflected the political turmoil of the age, and then when the turmoil was over and England began her mighty work of reform, how literature suddenly developed a new creative spirit which shows itself in the poetry of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and in the prose of Scott, Jane Austen, Lamb, and De Quincey. A wonderful group of writers whose patriotic enthusiasm suggests the Elizabethan days and whose genius has caused their age to be known as the second creative period of our literature. Thus, in the early days, when old institutions seemed crumbling with the Bastille, Coleridge and Southey formed their youthful scheme of a pantocracy on the banks of the Sequana, an ideal commonwealth in which the principles of more utopia should be put in practice. Even Wordsworth, hired with political enthusiasm, could write, "Bliss was it in that dawn to the alive, but to be young was very heaven." The essence of Romanticism was, it must be remembered, that literature must reflect all that is spontaneous and unaffected in nature and in man, and be free to follow its own fancy in its own way. We have already noted this characteristic in the work of the Elizabethan dramatists who followed their own genius in opposition to all the laws of the critics. In Coleridge, we see this independence expressed in Kubla Khan and the Ancient Mariner, two dreams pictures, one of the populous Orient, the other of the lonely sea. In Wordsworth, this literary independence led him inward to the heart of common things, following his own instinct as Shakespeare does. He too finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. And so, more than any other writer of the age, he invests the common life of nature and the souls of common men and women with glorious significance. These two poets, Coleridge and Wordsworth, best represent the romantic genius of the age in which they lived. Though Scott had a greater literary reputation and Byron and Shelley had larger audiences. The second characteristic of this age is that it is emphatically an age of poetry. The previous century, with its practical outlook on life, was largely one of prose. But now, as in Elizabethan age, the young enthusiasts turned as naturally to poetry as a happy man to singing. The glory of the age is in the poetry of Scott, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Moore and Southey. Of its prose works, those of Scott alone have attained a very wide reading, though the essays of Charles Lamb and the novels of Jane Austen have slowly won for their authors a secure place in the history of our literature. Coleridge and Southey, who with Wordsworth from the trio of so-called lag poets, wrote far more prose than poetry, and Southey's prose is much better than his verse. It was characteristic of the spirit of this age, so different from our own, that Southey could say that in order to earn money, he wrote in verse what would otherwise have been better written in prose. It was during this period that women assumed for the first time an important place in our literature. Probably the chief reason for this interesting phenomenon lies in the fact that women was for the first time given some slight chance of education, of entering into the intellectual life of the race. As is always the case, when woman is given anything like a fair opportunity, she responded magnificently. A secondary reason may be found in the nature of the age itself, which was intentionally emotional. The French Revolution stirred all Europe to its depth, and during the following half century, every great movement in literature, as in politics and religion, was characterized by strong emotion, which is all the more noticeable by contrast with the cold, formal, satiric spirit of the early 18th century. As woman is naturally more emotional than man, it may well be that the spirit of this emotional age attracted her and gave her the opportunity to express herself in literature. As all strong emotions tend to extremes, the age produced a new type of novel which seems rather hysterical now, but which in its own day delighted multitudes of readers whose nerves were somewhat excited and who revealed in bogey stories of supernatural terror. Mrs. Annie Radcliffe, 1764 to 1823, was one of the most successful writers of this school of exaggerated romance. Her novels, with their azure-eyed heroine, haunted castles, trapdoors, bandits, abductions, rescues in the nick of time, and a general wrought joys and horrors, were intentionally and immensely popular, not only with the crowd of novel readers, but also with men of unquestioned literary genius like Scott. In marked contrast to these extravagant stories is the enduring work of Jane Austen, with her charming descriptions of everyday life, and of Maria Edgeworth, whose wonderful pictures of Irish life suggested to Walter Scott the idea of writing his Scottish romances. Two other women who attained a more or less lasting fame were Hannah More, poet, dramatist, and novelist, and Jane Porter, whose Scottish chiefs and Thaddeus of Vara are still in demand in our libraries. Beside these were Fanny Burney, Madame d'Arblay, and several other writers whose works in the early part of the 19th century raised women to the high place in literature which she has ever since maintained. In this age, literary criticism became firmly established by the appearance of such magazines as the Edinburgh Review 1802, the Quarterly Review 1808, Blackwood's Magazine 1817, the Westminster Review 1824, the Spectator 1828, the Athenaeum 1828, and Fraser's Magazine 1830. These magazines, edited by such men as Francis Jeffrey, John Wilson, who is known to us as Christopher North, and John Gibson, Lockhart, who gave us the life of Scott, exercised an immense influence on all subsequent literature. At first, their criticism were largely destructive, as when Jeffrey hammered Scott, Wordsworth, and Byron could find no good in either Keats or Tennyson, but with added wisdom, criticism assumed its true function of construction, and when these magazines began to seek and to publish the works of unknown writers, Hazlitt, Lamb, and Leigh Hunt, they discovered the chief mission of the modern magazines, which is to give every writer of ability the opportunity to make his work known to the world. The poets of Romanticism, William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850. It was in 1797 that the new romantic movement in our literature definite form. Wordsworth and Coleridge retired to the Quintock Hills, Somerset, and there formed the deliberate purpose to make literature adapted to interest mankind permanently, which they declared classic poetry could never do. Helping the two poets was Wordsworth's sister Dorothy, with a woman's love for flowers and all beautiful things, and a woman's divine sympathy for human life, even in the loveliest forms. Though a silent partner, she furnished perhaps the largest share of the inspiration which resulted in the famous lyrical ballads of 1798. In their partnership, Coleridge was to take up the supernatural or at least romantic, while Wordsworth was to give the charm of novelty to things of every day by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. The whole spirit of their work is reflected in two poems of this remarkable little volume: The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is Coleridge's masterpiece and Lyne's writers a few miles above Tintern Abbey, while expresses Wordsworth's poetical creed, and which is one of the noblest and most significant of our poems, that the lyrical ballads attracted no attention and was practically ignored by a public that would soon go into raptures over Byron's Childe Harold and Dun John, is of small consequence. Many men will hurry a mile skyrockets who never notice Orlon and the Cleliades from their own doorstep. Had Wordsworth and Coleridge written only this one little book, they would still be among the representative writers of an age that final triumph of Romanticism. Life of Wordsworth. To understand the life of him who, in Tennyson's words, uttered nothing base, it is well to read first the prelude, which records the impressions made upon Wordsworth's mind from his earliest recollection until his full manhood in 1805, when the poem was completed. Outwardly, his long and uneventful life divides itself naturally into four periods. One is his childhood and youth in the Cumberland Hills from 1770 to 1787. Second is a period of uncertainty, of storm and stress, including his university life at Cambridge, his travels abroad, and his revolutionary experience from 1787 to 1797. Third is a period but significant period of finding himself and his work from 1797 to 1799. Fourth is a long period of retirement in the northern Lake region where he was born and where for a full half century he lived too close to nature. That her influence is reflected in all his poetry. When one has outlined these four periods, he has told almost all that can be told of a life which is marked not by events but largely by spiritual experiences. Wordsworth was born in 1770 at Cockermouth, Cumberland, where the Derwent, fairest of all rivers, loved to blend his murmurs with my nurse's song, and from his elder shades and rocky falls, and from his fonts and from his fords and shallows sent a voice that flown along my dreams. It is almost a shock to one who knows Wordsworth only by his calm and noble poetry, to read that he was of a moody and violent temper, and that his mother despaired of him alone among her 5 children, and she died when he was but 8 years old, but not till she had exerted, which lasted all his life, so that he could remember her as the heart of all our learnings and our loves. The father died some 6 years later, and the orphans was taken in charge by relatives who sent him to school at Hawkshead, at Hawkshead in the beautiful Lake region. Here, apparently, the unroofed school of nature attracted him more than the discipline of the classics, and he learned more eagerly from flowers and hills and stars than from his books. But one must read Wordsworth's own records in the prelude to appreciate this. 3 things in this poem must impress even the casual reader. First, Wordsworth loves to be alone and is never lonely with nature. Second, like every other child who spends much time alone in the woods and fields, he feels the presence of some living spirit, real through unseen and compassionable through silent. Third, his impressions are exactly like our own and delightfully familiar. When he tells of the long summer day spent in swimming, basking in the sun and twisting over the hills, or of the winter night when on his skates her castle, the reflection of a star in the black ice, or of his exploring the lake in a boat and getting suddenly frightened when the world grew big and strange. In all this, he is simply recalling a multitude of our own vague, happy memories of childhood. He goes out into the woods at night to tend his to tend his woodcock snares. He runs across another boy's snares, follows them, finds a woodcock caught, takes away through the night, and then I heard among the solitary hills low breathings coming after me and sounds of undistinguishable motion that is like a mental photograph. Any boy who has come home through the woods at night will recognize it instantly. Again, he tells us of going birds nesting on the cliffs. Oh, when I have hung above the raven's nest by knots of grass and half-inch fisheries in the slippery rock, and ill-sustained and almost suspended by the blast of that blew a man, shouldering the naked crag, who at that time, while on the ridge, I hung alone. With that strange utterance did the loud dry wind blow through my ears. The sky seemed not a sky of earth, and with what motion moved the clouds. No man no man can read such records without finding his own boyhood again and his own abounding joy of life. In the poet's early impressions, the second period of Wordsworth's life begins with his university course at Cambridge in 1787. In the third book of the Prelude, we find a dispassionate account of student life with its trivial occupations, its pleasures, and general aimlessness. Wordsworth proved to be a very ordinary scholar, following his own genius rather than the curriculum, and looking forward more eagerly to his vacation among the hills than to his examinations. Perhaps the most interesting thing in his life at Cambridge was his fellowship with the young thing in his life at Cambridge was the fellowship with the young political enthusiast, whose spirit is expressed in his remarkable poem on the French Revolution, a poem which is better than a volume of history to show the hopes and ambitions that stirred all Europe in the first days of that mighty upheaval. Wordsworth made two trips to France in 1790 and 1791, seeing things chiefly through the rosy spectacles of the young Oxford Republicans. On his second visit, he joined the Girondist or the moderate Republicans, and only the decision of his relatives, who cut off his allowance and hurried him back to England, prevented his going headlong to the guillotine with the leaders of his party. Two things rapidly cooled Wordsworth's revolutionary enthusiasm and ended the only dramatic interest of his placid life. One was the excesses of the revolution itself, and especially the execution of Louis XVI. The other was the rise of Napoleon and the slavish adulation accorded by France to this most vulgar and dangerous of tyrants. His coolness soon grew to disgust and opposition, as shown by his subsequent poems, and this brought upon him the censure of Shelley, Byron, and other extremists, though it gained the friendship of Scott, who from the first had no sympathy with the revolution or with the young English enthusiast of the decisive period of Wordsworth's life, when he was living with his sister Dorothy and with Coleridge at Alfoxden. We have already spoken. The importance of this decision to give himself to poetry is evident when we remember that at 30 years of age he was without money or any definite aim or occupation in life. He considered the law, but confessed he had no sympathy for its contradictory precepts and practices. He considered the ministry, but though strongly inclined to the church, he felt himself not good enough for the sacred office. Once he had wanted to be a soldier and serve his country, but had wavered at the prospect of dying of disease in a foreign land and throwing away his life without glory anybody. An apparent accident which looks more to us like a special providence determined his course. He had taken care of a young friend who died of consumption and left Wordsworth here to a few £100 and to the request that he should give his life to poetry. It was this unexpected gift which enabled Wordsworth to retire from the world and follow his genius. All his life he was poor and lived in an atmosphere of plain living and high thinking. His poetry brought him almost nothing in the way of money rewards, and it was only by a series of happy accidents that he was enabled to continue his work. One of these accidents was that a Tory and soon accepted the other of a distributor, soon accepted the office of a distributor of stamps, and was later appointed poet laureate by the government, which occasions but ill-considered poems of the lost leader. Just for a handful of silver he left us, just for a riband to stick in his coat. The last half century of Wordsworth's life, in which he retired to his beloved Lake District and lived Grasmere and Riddlemount, remind one strongly of Browning's long struggle for literary recognition. It was marked by the name and by the same steadfast purpose, the same trusted ideal, the same continuous work, and the same tardy recognition by the public. His poetry was mercilessly ridiculed by nearly all the magazine critics, who seized upon the worst of his work as a standard of judgment, and book after book of poems appeared without meeting any success save the approval of a few loyal friends. Without doubt or impatience, he continued his work, trusting to the future to recognize and approve it. His attitude here reminds one strongly of the poor old soldier whom he met in the hills, who refused to beg or to mention his long service to the neglect of his country, saying with noble simplicity, "My trust is in the God of heaven and in the eye of him who passes me." Such work and patience are certain of their reward, and long before Wordsworth's death, he felt the warm sunshine of general approval. The wave of the popular enthusiasm for Scott and Byron passed by as their limitations were recognized, and Wordsworth was hailed by critics as the first living poet and one of the greatest that England had ever produced. On the death of Southey, 1843, he was made poet laureate against his own inclination. The late excessive praise left him quite as unmoved as the first excessive neglect. The steady decline in the quality of his work is due not, as might be expected, to self-satisfaction at success, but rather to his intense conservatism, to his living too much alone and failing to test his work by the standards and judgment of other literary men. He died tranquilly in 1850 at the age of 80 years and was buried in the churchyard at Grasmere. Such is the brief outward record of the world's greatest interpreter of nature's message, and only one who is acquainted with both nature and the poet can realize how inadequate is any biography. Must always remain unsaid. It is a comfort to know that his life, noble, sincere, heroically happy, never contradicted his message. Poetry was his life. His soul was in all his work, and only by what he was written can we understand the man. The poetry of Wordsworth, there is often a sense of disappointment when one reads Wordsworth for the first time, and this leads us to speak first of two difficulties which may easily prevent a just appreciation of the poet's worth. The first difficulty is in the reader, who is often puzzled by Wordsworth's absolute simplicity. We are so used to stage effects in poetry that beauty unadorned is apt to escape our notice, like Wordsworth's Lucy, a violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky. Wordsworth set himself to the task of freeing poetry from all its conceits of speaking and language of simple truth, and of portraying man and nature as they are. And in this good work, we are apt to miss the beauty, the passion, the intensity that hide themselves under his simplest lines. The second difficulty is in the poet, not in the reader. Graceful and only occasionally inspired. When he is inspired, few poets can be compared with him. At other times, the bulk of his verse is to the bulk of his verse is so we wonder how a poet could have written it. Moreover, he is absolutely without humor, and so he often fails to see the small step that separates the sublime from the ridiculous. In no other way we can explain the idiot boy or pardon the serious absurdity of Peter Bell and his grieving jackass. On account of this, it is well to avoid at first the longer works and begin with a good book of selections. When we read these exquisite shorter poems with their noble lines that live forever in our memory, we realize that Wordsworth is the best poet of nature that our literature has produced. If we go further and study the poems that impress us, we shall find four remarkable characteristics. Wordsworth is sensitive as barometer to every subtle change in the word about him. In the prelude, he compares himself to an Aeolian harp which answers with harmony to every touch of the wind, and the figure is strikingly accurate as well as interesting, for there is hardly a sight or a sound from a violet to a mountain and from a bird cataract that is not reflected in some beautiful way in Wordsworth's poetry. Of all the poets who have written of nature, there is none that compares with him in the truthfulness of his representation. Burns, like Gray, is apt to read his own emotions into natural objects, so that there is more of the poet than of nature, even in his mouse and daisy. But Wordsworth gives you the bird and the flower, the wind and the tree and the river just as they are, and is content to let them speak their own message. No other poet ever found such abundant beauty in the common world. He had not only sight but insight. That is, he not only sees clearly and describes accurately, but penetrates to the heart of things and always finds some exquisite meaning that is not written on the surface. It is idle to specify or to quite lines to quit lines on flowers or stars, on snow or vapor. Nothing is ugly or commonplace in his world. On the contrary, there is hardly one natural phenomena which he has not glorified by pointing out some beauty that was hidden from our eyes. It is the life of nature, which is everywhere recognized, not mere growth and shell changes, but sentiment, personal life, and the recognition of this personality in nature characterizes all the world's great poetry. In his childhood, Wordsworth regarded natural objects, the streams, the hills, the flowers, even the winds as his companions, and with his mature belief that all nature is a reflection of the living God, it was inevitable that his poetry should thrill with the spirit that rolls through all things. Copper, Burns, Keats, Tennyson, all these poets give you the outward aspects of nature in varying degrees, but Wordsworth gives you her very life and the impression of some personal living spirit that meets and accompanies the man who gives alone through the woods and fields. We shall hardly find, even in the philosophy of Leibniz or in the nature myths of our Indians, any such impression of living nature as this poet awakens in us. And that suggests another delightful characteristic of Wordsworth's poetry, namely that he seems to awaken rather than create an impression. He stirs our memory deeply so that in reading him we live once more in the vague, beautiful wonderland of our own childhood. Such is the philosophy of Wordsworth's nature poetry. If we search now for his philosophy of human life, we shall find four more doctrines which rest upon his basal conception that man is not apart from nature but is the very life of our life. One is, in childhood man is sensitive as a wind warp to all natural influences. He is an epitome of the gladness and beauty of the world. Wordsworth explains this gladness and this sensitiveness to nature by the doctrine that the child comes straight from the creator of nature. Dear friends, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life is a star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. In this exquisite ode, which he calls Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, 1807, Wordsworth sums up his philosophy of childhood, and he may possibly be indebted here to the poet Wagon, who more than a century before had proclaimed in the retreat the same doctrine. This kinship with nature and with God, which glorifies childhood, ought to extend through a man's whole life and ennoble it. This is the teaching of Tintern Abbey, in which the best part of our life is shown to be the result of natural influences. According to Wordsworth, society and the crowded, unnatural life of cities tend to weaken and pervert humanity, and a return to natural and simple living is the only remedy for human wretchedness. The natural instinct and pleasures of childhood are the true standards of a man's happiness in this life. All artificial pleasures soon grow tiresome. The natural pleasure which a man so easily neglects in his work are the chief means by which we may expect permanent and increasing joy. In Tintern Abbey, the rainbow ode to duty and intimations of immortality, we see this plain teaching, but we can hardly read one of the Wordsworth's pages without finding it slipped in unobtrusively like the fragrance of a wildflower. The truth of humanity, that is, the common life which labors and loves and shares the general heritage of smiles and tears, is the only subject of permanent literary interest. Burns and the early poets of the revival began the good work of showing the romantic interest of common life, and Wordsworth continued it in Michel, the solitary reaper, to a Highland girl stepping westward, the excursions, and a score of lesser poems. Joy and sorrow, not of princes or heroines, but in wildest commonality spread, are his themes set, and the hidden purposes of many of his poems is to show that the keynote of all life is happiness, not an occasional thing, the result of chance or circumstance, but a heroic thing to be won as one would win any other as success by work and patience. To this natural philosophy of man, Wordsworth adds a mystic element. The result of his own belief that in every natural object there is a reflection of the living God. Nature is everywhere transfused and illuminated by spirit. Man also is a reflection of the divine spirit, and we shall never understand the emotions roused by a flower or a sunset until we learn the nature appeals through the eye of man to his inner spirit. In a word, nature must be spiritually discerned in Tintern Abbey. The spiritual appeal of nature is expressed in almost every line, but the mystic conception of man is seen more clearly in intimations of immortality, which emerge watermark of poetry in the 19th century. In this last splendid ode, Wordsworth adds to his spiritual interpretation of nature and man the alluring doctrine of pre-existence, while has appealed so powerfully to Hindus and Greek in turn, and which makes of human life a continuous immortal thing without end or beginning. Wordsworth's longer poems, since they contain much that is prosy and uninteresting, many will be left till and odes. We have read the odes, sonnets, and short descriptive poems that have made him famous, as showing a certain heroic cast of Wordsworth's mind. It is interesting to learn that the greater part of his work, including the prelude and the excursion, was extended for a place in a single great man and society. The prelude, treating of the growth of a poet's mind, was to introduce the work, The Home at Grasmere, which is the first book of the Recluse, was not published till 1888, long after the poet's death. 1814 is the second book of the Recluse, and the third was never completed, though Wordsworth intended to include most of his shorter poems in this third part. and so make an immense personal epic of a poet's life and work. It is perhaps just as well that the work remained unfinished. The best of his work appeared in the lyrical ballads in 1798 and in the sonnets, odes, and lyrics of the next 10 years, though Dubon, the Dudden Sonnets 1820 to a Skylark 1825 and Yarrow Revisited 1831 show that he retained till past 60 much of his youthful enthusiasm. In his later years, however, he perhaps wrote too much. His poetry, like his prose, becomes dull and unimaginative, and we miss the flashes of insight, the tender memories of childhood, and the recurrence of noble lines, each one a poem, that constitutes the surprise and the delight of reading Wordsworth. The outward shows of sky and earth, of hill and valley, he has viewed, and impulses of deeper birth have come to him a solitude. In common things that round us lie some random truths he can impart, the harvest of a quiet eye that broods and sleeps on his own heart. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. A grief without a pang, void, dark and drear, a stiff, drowsy, unimpassioned grief which finds no natural outlet, no relief in word or sigh or tear. In the wonderful ode to dejection, from which the above fragment is taken, we have a single strong impression of Coleridge's whole life, a sad, broken, tragic life, in marked contrast with the peaceful existence of his friend Wordsworth. For himself, during the greater part of his life, the poet had only grief and remorse as his portion. But for everybody else, for the audiences that were charmed by the brilliancy of his literary lectures, for the friends who gathered about him to be inspired by his ideals and conversation, and for all his readers who found unending delight in the little volume which holds his poetry, he had and still has a cheering message full of beauty and hope and inspiration, such as Coleridge's A Man of Grief who makes the world glad. Life in 1772, there lived in Autry, St. Mary, Devonshire, a queer little man, the Reverend John Coleridge, vicar of the parish church and master of the local grammar school. In the former capacity, he preached profound sermons, quoting to open mouth rustics long passages from the Hebrew, which he told them was the very tongue of the Holy Ghost. In the latter capacity, he wrote for his boys and a new Latin grammar. To mitigate some of the difficulties of traversing that terrible jungle by means of the ingenious bypaths and shortcuts. For instance, when his boys found the ablative is somewhat difficult case to understand, he told them to think of it as the quail as the qualitative case, guidative case, which of course makes its meaning perfectly clear. In both these capacities, the elder Coleridge was a sincere man. In both these capacities, the elder Coleridge was a sincere man, gentle and kindly, whose memory was like a religion to his sons and daughters. In that same year was born Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the youngest of 13 children. He was an extraordinary, precious child who could read at 3 years of age and who, before he was 5, had read the Bible and the Arabian Nights and could remember an astonishing amount from both books. From 3 to 6, he attended a dam school, and from 6 till 9, when his father died and left the family destitute, he was in his father's school, learning the classics, reading an enormous quantity of English books, avoiding novels, and delighting in cumbrous theological and metaphysical treatises. At 10, he was sent to the Charity School of Christ's Hospital, London, where he met Charles Lamb, who records his impression of the place and of Coleridge in one of his famous essays. Coleridge seems to have remained in this school for 7 or 8 years without visiting his home, a poor, neglected boy whose comforts and entertainments were all within himself. Just as when a little child he used to wander over the fields with a stick in his hand, slashing the tops from weeds and thistles, and thinking himself to be the mighty champion of Christendom against the infidels. So now he would lie on the roof of the school, forgetting the play of his fellows and the roar of the London streets, watching the white clouds drifting over and following them in spirit into all sorts of romantic adventures. At 19, this hopeless dreamer, who had read more books than an old professor, entered Cambridge as a charity student. He remained for nearly 3 years, then ran away because of a trifling debt and enlisted in the Dragons, where he served several months before he was discovered and brought back to the university. He left in 1794 without taking his degree, and presently we find him with the youthful Southey, a kindred spirit who had been fired to wild enthusiasm by the French Revolution, founding his famous Pantisocracy for the regeneration of human society. The Fall of Robespierre, a poem composed by the two enthusiasts, is full of the new revolutionary spirit. The Pantisocracy on the banks of the Susquehanna was to be an ideal community in which the citizens combined a farming and literature, and work was to be limited to 2 hours each day. Moreover, each member of the community was to marry a good woman and take her with him. The two poets obeyed the latter injunction first, marrying 2 sisters, and then found that they had no money to pay even their traveling expenses to the new utopia. During all the rest of his career, A tragic weakness of will takes possession of college, making it impossible for him, with all his genius and learning, to hold himself steadily to any one work or purpose. He studied in Germany, worked as a private secretary till the drudgery were upon his free spirit. Then he went to Rome and remained for 2 years, lost in study. Later he started The Friend, a paper devoted to truth and liberty, lectured on poetry and the fine arts to interrupted audiences in London, until his frequent failure to meet his engagements scattered his hearers, was offered an excellent position and a half interest in the Morning Post and the Career, but declined it, saying that I would not give up the country and the lazy reading of old folios for 2000 times 2000 pounds. In short, that beyond 350 pound a year, I considered money a real evil. His family, meanwhile, was almost entirely neglected. He lived apart, following his own way, and the wife and children were left in charge of his friend Saudi. Needing money, he was on the point of becoming a Unitarian minister, when a small pension from two friends enabled him to live for a few years without regular employment. A terrible shadow in Coleridge's life was the apparent cause of most of his dejection. In the early life, he suffered from neuralgia, and to ease the pain began to use opiates. Opiates. The result on such a temperament was almost inevitable. He became a slave to the drug habit. His naturally weak will lost all its directing and sustaining force, until after 15 years of pain and struggle and despair, he gave up and put himself in charge of a physician, one Mr. Gilman of Highgate, Carlyle, who visited him at this time, calls him a king of men, but records that he gave you the idea of a life that had been full of sufferings, a life heavy laden, half vanquished, still swimming painfully in seas of manifold physical and other bewilderment. The shadow is dark indeed, but there are gleams of sunshine that occasionally break through the clouds. One of these is his association with Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy in the Quantock Hills, out of which came the famous lyrical ballads of 1798. Another was his loyal devotion to poetry for its own sake, with the exception of his tragedy Remorse, which through Byron's influence was accepted at Drury Lane Theatre, and for which he was paid £400. He received almost nothing for poetry. Indeed, he seems not to have desired it, for he says, poetry has been to me its own exceeding great reward. It has soothed my afflictions. It has multiplied and refined my enjoyments. It has endeared solitude, and it has given me the habit of wishing to discover the good and the beautiful in all that meets and surrounds me. One can better understand his exquisite verse after such a declaration. A third ray of sunlight came from the admiration of his contemporaries. For though he wrote comparatively little, he was by his talents and learning a leader among literary men, and his conversations were as eagerly listened to as we were those of Dr. Johnson. Wordsworth says of him, that though other men of the age had done some wonderful things, Coleridge was the only wonderful man he had ever known. Of his lectures on literature, a contemporary says, his words seem to flow as from a person repeating with grace and energy some delightful poem. And some of his conversation it is recorded how throughout a long drawn summer's day would this man talk to you in low, equable but clear and musical tones concerning things human and divine, marshalling all history, harmonizing all experiment, probing the depth of your consciousness and revealing visions of glory and terror to the imagination. The last bright ray of sunlight comes from Coleridge's own soul, from the gentle, kindly nature which made men love and respect him in spite of his weaknesses, and which caused Lamb to speak of him humorously as an archangel a little damaged. The universal law of suffering seems to be that it refines and softens humanity, and Coleridge was no exception to the law. In his poetry, we find a note of human sympathy, more tender and profound than can be found in Wordsworth or indeed in any other of the great English poets. Even in his later poems, when he has lost his first inspiration and something of the splendid imaginative power that makes his work equal to the best of blacks, we find a soul tender, triumphant, quiet, in the stillness of a great grace, great peace. He died in 1834 and was buried in Highgate Church. The last stanza, the boatman's song, in remorse, serves better to express the word's judgment than any epitaph. Hark, the cadence dies away on the quiet moonlit sea. The boatmen rest their oars and say, Misri Domini. Works of Coleridge. The works of Coleridge naturally divide themselves into three classes: the poetic, the critical, and the philosophical, corresponding to the early, the middle, and the later periods of the career. Of his poetry, Stopford Brooke well says, all that he did excellently might be bound up in 20 pages, but it should be bound in pure gold. His early poems show the influence of grey and black, especially of the latter, when Coleridge begins his daydreams with the line, My eyes make pictures when they are shut. We recall instantly Black's haunting songs of innocence. But there is this difference between the two poets. In Black, we have only a dreamer. In Coleridge, we have the rare combination of the dreamer and the profounder and the profound scholar. The quality of this early poetry, with its strong suggestion of black, may be seen in such poems as A Daydream, The Devil's Thoughts, The Suicide's Argument, and The Wanderings of Cain. His later poems, wherein we see his imagination bridled by thought and study, but still running very freely, may best be appreciated in Kubla Khan, Charitable, and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Such poems, one can only read them and wonder at their melody and at the vague suggestions which they conjure up in the mind. Kubla Khan is a fragment painting a gorgeous oriental dream picture, such as one might see in an October sunset. The whole poem came to Coleridge one morning when he had fallen asleep over perchance, and upon awakening he began to write hastily. In Kubla Khan, Aksendu did Kubla Khan. Dear friends, listeners and learners of English literature, I, Dr. Rakesh, appreciate your presence today, listening the truth of literature and language. Thanks all of you.